Richard Marles, welcome.
Morning, David.
So the Minister there says selfish, indulgent, reckless, unacceptable. Do you agree?
Oh, that feels tone deaf for me. Look, I get this is a vexed issue, as Catherine said earlier. I think that's a good word to describe it. And certainly I had concerns about such a mass gathering in the middle of a pandemic, and I used my voice in the lead up to the protest to make that point. But if you are born Indigenous in this country, your life stands to be materially worse than those of us who are born non-Indigenous in terms of child mortality, education, employment and incarceration. Now, I don't feel like I'm in a position to say to Indigenous Australians who are protesting against that this is a selfish and indulgent act. I felt uncomfortable about the mass gathering, but I'm not about to engage in that kind of judgment of those who did it.
Well, this is the conundrum, though, isn't it? So should they have gone or not?
Well, I would have preferred that we didn't see the mass gathering, but it's happened and I understand it, and I understand why people did go out. And we've got a major issue in this country. To suggest that this is something which is imported is patently ridiculous. And to say of those people who are standing up against it and are seeking to do something about it that this is an act of indulgence and selfishness is patently wrong.
If there was another one planned, would you go?
Well, I didn't go to this one, and I wouldn't go to another one planned in the middle of a pandemic.
And would you advise others?
And I would advise people not to go, which is what I did in the lead up to this weekend. But there's a difference between that and engaging in that kind of commentary of those who have made this decision. I think it's really difficult. I don't think this is an easy call. And so I've made my call, but I understand those who made a different call, and I understand the issue that's out there, and I don't think people engaging in it are selfish or indulgent.
What about the Prime Minister agreeing to go to the G7 in the United States? Is that an easy call? Has he made the right call?
Yeah, he has made the right call, and that is an easy call. I mean, if Australia is invited to a gathering of that kind, of course you go. I think there are difficulties in that, as you've just discussed. And again, the point that was made by Catherine, that it's how he handles himself in that moment, which is the real issue, is exactly right. If he does find himself there with Russia present, then it's really important that Australia exercises its voice in that moment, that he exercises his voice in that moment around the downing of MH17. But I think it's obviously the case that if invited to a gathering of this kind, Australia must be there.
What do the events of the last 10 days in the United States tell us about Donald Trump and where that country's gone under his presidency?
Well, ultimately, it'll be for Americans to decide the fate of Donald Trump at the end of this year at the election, and I'll leave that to them. I think what I see is a country which is wrestling with the issue of racism, and that issue has a long historical context in the United States going back to its very origins.
And is Donald Trump trying to heal that, do you think?
Well, again, I'll leave that to the American public and for them to give their verdict. But the point I would make is that leaders in this moment, in moments of crisis, and I say that in relation to a pandemic, but moments of crisis in terms of divisions within their own societies, need to be there to heal those divisions and to try and bring people together.
And is the President doing that?
Well, again, that's ultimately a judgment for the American people, and so I'm not going to enter that. But what I would say is that it does highlight the issue of racism around the world, and it highlights the fact that we're not immune from racism here, and that we have our own set of issues here, which we must deal with. And we're 12 years after the apology to the stolen generation. The gap that we so fervently hoped on that day that we would see closing has remained stubbornly high, and we need to be doing everything we can and using this moment to recommit ourselves to trying to do something about that.
Putting aside the internal issues in the US, what do you think the Trump presidency has meant for US global leadership?
Well, it's a good question. I think that we want to have an ally and I guess the global superpower acting in a predictable way. Certainly that's how we would want to see it from the position of an ally, from our perspective. I think what we've got with the President is a person who sees his own unpredictability as a virtue. And I understand how that's probably worked for him and in parts of his life. I also understand how at times that unpredictability has opened up opportunities on the international stage. But ultimately, it's really important that we have a leader of the United States acting in the world in a way which is highly predictable.
And we're not getting that at the moment.
Well, from my point of view, I certainly think that we see a high degree of unpredictability in the kind of statements that the President makes. I've said on many occasions I'm not a fan of diplomacy by tweet, and I think that from the perspective of an ally, it makes it hard when you don't have a clear line of sight.
On China, yesterday China issued some travel advice to its own citizens not to come to Australia. It said there'd been racial discrimination and violence against Chinese and Asian people in Australia. There'd been a significant increase since COVID-19. Have you witnessed that?
I've not witnessed it in quite the language that's been used by the Chinese, and ultimately I do agree with Simon Birmingham in his comments about the fact that I don't think that fairly describes where Australia is at. I mean, we're clearly not free from the issue of racism, and I'm sure that there are Chinese Australians who have been on the receiving end of that, but I think the way in which that statement is framed does not accurately describe where Australia is at. As always, we have to take what the Chinese statement is on face value, but I think what this ultimately raises is the relationship between Australia and China has not been tracking in a very good direction for the last few years, well before COVID happened, well before there was a call from the Australian government around seeking an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. It is a completely complex relationship where our trade matters, where there are hundreds of thousands of Australian jobs, farmers, people in rural Australia, people in a range of industries who are dependent on that trade with China. And this is a relationship which has to be dealt with properly and taken seriously. And we've got a government and leaders in it which often are absent in the debate.
Well, there's another conundrum in that debate, that relationship. China is, as you know, now moving to impose tougher national security laws on Hong Kong. Should Australia offer safe haven visas to Hong Kong residents?
Well, this is a matter which is being led by the United Kingdom, as it's appropriate to do. Certainly the national security laws that are being proposed by China are of concern. They stand really against the proposition of one country, two systems, and the obligations that China held out to the people of Hong Kong at the time of the handover, and indeed the obligations that they held out to the world.
And they may want to flee, so should we offer them safe haven?
I think if ultimately there is a call from Britain, who is leading this, to Australia, I actually think that is a call that we need to take very seriously.
So we should say yes to safe haven visas?
Well, I think the specifics of how you enact that is really a matter of detail down the track. I think the first point, though, is should we be there? I mean, exactly what visa you use and how it works.
Well, there's precedent for this. I mean, Bob Hawke famously, of course, offered safe haven visas for those who fled, and indeed those who were already here when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. Tony Abbott did the same for Syrians. There's precedent here. Shouldn't we just offer safe haven visas?
Well, I think what we ultimately need to do is offer help. Maybe that's the way we do it, but ultimately that is a matter down the track. But I think the important point here is this: we have an affinity with the people of Hong Kong and that part of the world, and a long history. We are a country which has and which should continue to play its part when there are matters of humanitarian distress. And if ultimately we are called upon to provide assistance in this moment, then I think that's a call that we need to take very seriously.
Does Labor support the tighter foreign investment rules that were announced by the government on Friday for sensitive strategic assets in Australia, water, energy, ports and so on? Basically having all of these investments, whether they're from public or private, regardless of value, scrutinised by the Foreign Investment Review Board and the Treasurer?
Look, I think the direction of this is sensible. We haven't seen the detail of it, and we'd obviously like to. But the principle here is that when we're talking about national security, the government needs to have a free hand in relation to the way in which it treats foreign investment into this country, and that should be an absolute principle. Obviously, in saying that, make the point that foreign investment has been critical to the development of this country, and we need to be welcoming welcoming of foreign investment, fundamentally. It's part of being an open trading economy, which has been the basis of having had, up until now, three decades of economic growth. And so I think that foreign investment is important, but that national security should be a lens that through which this is seen and judged is completely appropriate.
Should these laws apply retrospectively to the Port of Darwin lease?
Well, we have been concerned about the sale of the Port of Darwin to a Chinese state-owned company. I would much prefer that the Port of Darwin be in Australian hands right now. It's a point that we made, and obviously all of that happened whilst Scott Morrison was the Treasurer of this country. Whatever though we do going forward, we shouldn't be engaging in sovereign risk. I mean, this is something which has happened in the past.
Okay, so not retrospective.
Well, I think retrospectivity can often give rise to sovereign risk, and we shouldn't be engaging in acts of sovereign risk.
On the economy, the Treasurer confirmed this week that Australia is in recession. What reforms are needed, do you think, to get Australia out of recession?
Well, the government obviously doesn't own the impact of the coronavirus. This is not their doing or their fault. The government certainly does own the economy that went into the coronavirus. And this was an economy in which we were seeing labour productivity going backwards for the first time in decades. For the first time in decades.
Well, the government would argue different figures on what was happening before. I'm asking what we do now to get out of recession. Does Labor have any ideas?
Yeah, we do, but let's be clear about that. There's no arguing those figures. There's no arguing the fact that labour productivity went stagnant and then backwards.
Unemployment was edging down. But look, I just want to focus on what we do to get out of recession, if we can, for a moment. What are these ideas that Labor has?
Because, David, diagnosing the problem going into this gives illumination of what the answer is coming out.
So what is
what we need to do is to be improving labour productivity, and in doing that, we need to be investing in science and technology. We need to be investing in skills. We need to be investing in education. Now, I listened to the Prime Minister in his speech talk about the importance of universities. Well, this is a government since 2013 which has strangled funding to universities. He talked about the importance of having a resilient manufacturing sector. This is the government that goaded the car industry offshore.
Okay.
He talked about, these are the points, David. He talked about the importance of skills and training.
Okay, so your answer is to spend more in those areas you identify. I'm just wondering, is there any...
Well, it's not just about spending. It is about focusing on the need to have a much more resilient economy in terms of manufacturing. First world economies that engage in manufacturing do it at the high end. Places like Korea, places like Germany. If we're going to make things of that kind, we need to climb the technological ladder, and frankly, David, we don't do that unless we have a complete change in our cultural relationship to science. Now, this is a government which has completely failed the scientific community, both in terms of its funding to basic research, to its funding to universities, but also in terms of how it's led the whole debate.
Let me ask you about
the
policy that was announced this week by the government. This is the home builder package, grants of $25,000 to build or renovate if you're willing to spend at least $150,000. We know Labor's been very critical of this. Now, my understanding is this does not require legislation, so it will not go before the House. Should Parliament have a say on spending $680 million in this way?
Well, Parliament should be having a say in the way in which stimulus is rolled out. The problems with this program you've answered in the way in which you've posed the question. I mean, we're talking about $150,000 renovations that is what's needed to qualify, and you've got to be earning under $125,000 to qualify. I mean, those things don't add up.
Labor would oppose it?
This provides help. And so that's good,
so
but it doesn't. Well, it's not a matter of opposing and supporting; it's a matter of improving.
Well,
and this is the point.
With respect, it's a fair question to ask if Labor supports or opposes it.
Well, if that's ultimately the question that's put before us right now, though, I think what we could say is...
What do you say right now?
Right now, we say it could be done better, and we make this point that there was forecast to be 160,000 houses built in this country before COVID struck. With the advent of COVID, that's now 100,000, a gap of 60,000. By the government's own figures, this measure is only going to add 10,000 houses to that pool.
Okay, and the legitimate points, but just to be clear on this, you're saying it should come before Parliament. but you can't be clear about whether you'd support it or oppose
Well,
it.
we think this should be done a whole lot better, and we've been talking about, over the last few weeks, a range of measures in this area about spending more on social housing, trying to bring that spending forward, around removing the cap on the first home owner grant scheme. All of those are measures that could be done to get a better outcome here. But let's be clear, they've spent 1/10 of what was spent during the global financial crisis to deal with this area. There's 1 million people who work in home construction. The majority of those, 5 out of 6 of those who have lost their jobs, are not going to get them back by virtue of this initiative.
Richard Marles, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dad.